Thorium is better because it is more difficult to turn into nuclear weapons on the back end. So if you can remove a lot of the proliferation concerns of a uranium power cycle, then maybe we can get rid of some of the obstacles to adopting nuclear power on a broader scale. The short version is probably not, but to understand that, you have to understand how uranium works. So when you mine uranium, you get something that is basically ore where a very small percentage of it is usable. Uranium decays over time, over decades, over centuries, over millennia, and you only get a few tenths of a percent of it that is actually the stuff that you need. So what you have to do is you have to mill it to get rid of all the stuff you don't need at all, and you're left with raw uranium in a form that they call yellow cake, which is a powder. And then you complex that in a compound called uranium hexafluoride, which is solid at room temperature. So you then heat it up a lot and throw it into a gas centrifuge where you spin out the different isotopes. When nuclear material degrades, half-life, all that good stuff, it comes up with different atomic weights. And by putting it into a gas chamber and centrifuging it down, you can increase the cut of the part that is actually fissile that you can use to achieve an atomic reaction. And in the case of a civilian power system, you're after something between 3.5% and 5% roughly. Everyone has their own preferred mix, but that's usually the range. Now, once you have that kind of enriched fuel, you then compound it into a structure like a fuel rod, and then that goes into a nuclear power reactor where it goes through fission. The fission generates heat, the heat drives turbines, the turbines generate the electricity. That's grossly oversimplified. That's basically how it works. Okay. On the back side, when you have a spent fuel rod, what has happened is that the uranium, that is the fissile component, has changed. And now its waste material is plutonium. And people can take the plutonium from spent nuclear fuel rods and make plutonium-based nuclear weapons. Now, if you're going to do something with thorium, the problem is it doesn't make it too much better. Plutonium is still the byproduct. And while you don't generate as much plutonium from the use of thorium in your nuclear reactor as you do from uranium, you still get some. In addition, you need a different kind of reactor. The fuel rod fabrication system is different. The purification system is different. The nuclear power reactor system is different. So in exchange for doing a completely new fuel cycle and a completely new power cycle, you're only getting like a quarter less plutonium. Now, yes, it's in a slightly more complicated chemical mix. Does require a little bit different equipment, a little bit more skill in order to extract a thorium-based plutonium byproduct. But the people who are making nuclear weapons aren't doing it for economic reasons. And if you have a standard 1 gigawatt uranium-based nuclear power system, you're going to generate enough waste plutonium every year to make about 6 to 12 crude plutonium devices. You do this with thorium, you might only have enough for 4 to 10. It's a marginal difference, honestly. So it's an interesting technology, and for countries like India, who have a lot more thorium than they do uranium, it's probably worth exploring just for the power sake. But it's not going to solve anything on a non-proliferation issue. Neither is it a silver bullet that will solve the nuclear industry's problems. The big issues you have with the nuclear industry, in addition to proliferation, are you've got the spent waste you have to do something with. Now, in a uranium-based fuel cycle, you can recycle those rods, but doing so extracts the plutonium. And so now you've got plutonium sitting around in probably civilians' hands, which is one of the reasons why in the United States, we, for the most part, don't reprocess it. During the Cold War, it kind of worked because the military could take that plutonium away, but now the military has been slimming down its nuclear arsenal for decades. Demand just isn't there. There is no other use for plutonium, really. It's at least not in the volume that it produces this stuff. And so you're left with a waste disposition issue. Now, other countries have addressed this, if that's the right word, by having some sort of government facility where most of this stuff goes and is interred or is mixed with glass or is buried or whatever. None of these things really solve the problem, but they at least address them. In the United States, we've got something called Yucca Mountain, which is a big storage facility, but it's completely oversubscribed already, which means in the United States, right now, all that spent fuel unprocessed typically is stored on the reactor site in a coolant pond, which I would argue is not the best idea. But until we get a couple acts of Congress that either deal with the reprocessing and the plutonium extraction and or create a fundamentally new storage facility that can handle all of the volumes that we need to handle, we're kind of at a stalling point with the nuclear industry in the United States. Barring the development of fundamentally new technologies, of which there are a few interesting ones in play, we're actually going to be seeing nuclear power fall drastically as a percentage of our overall fuel mix. It's been about 20% of the total for the last few decades, but we've only had one new plant come online since 1973. And pretty much all of them are going to be decommissioned over the next 15 to 20 years, which we may have questions over whether that's a smart thing to do, but these facilities are a half-century old plus, which means that with all the solar and wind, assuming it's working perfectly, we're really just going to be standing still when it comes to generation of electricity, much less decarbonization. So this is a piece of the I've written in and wondering if we're on the verge of a new era of exploration and exploitation and development. Can't rule it out, but a couple things to keep in mind. Number one, the Arctic is, for the most part, completely unpopulated. And so even if you have a wonderful mineral resource, you then have to go into tundra in order to build roads or ports or airstrips. Tundra is not great land to deal with. In the summer, it tends to turn into a full-on swamp. So if you're going to have a town, it has to be elevated. And if you're going to have a road, it has to be on a raised berm that stretches hundreds, if not thousands of miles, which is why most of the remote places in Russia and Canada for mining aren't on the road network. You basically fly in, and then the place is just a frozen version of hell in the winter. If you want to do offshore, you're not just dealing with ice, you're dealing with moving sea ice, which means that most of what you have to do has to be under the ice, and yet it still has to be pumped back to the shore where it can be stored until the ice melts in the summer. So now you also need storage. So your cost for development for facilities up there is very high. The maintenance cost is extreme, and you're not going to be able to have a regular income stream because you can only ship out seasonally. Then there's the problem that where there are populations on the or above the Arctic Circle are very, very limited. You basically have two categorizations. The first is you've got the Russians, because during the Soviet period, the Soviets saw the entire Arctic zone as a zone for national security, and even though it made no economic sense, they settled people up there to the tune of a few million. Now, the vast majority of those people have found ways to get back to warmer climes, but there are still places like Murmansk and Norilsk that are way up there. The thing is, no one is going to sink the capital and technology that is necessary to develop the Russian Arctic. Exxon was doing a little bit on this in places like Murmansk and Vendré, I'm sure I mispronounced that, sorry Russians, and the Yamal Peninsula, but in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, that money's gone away. And there aren't a lot of companies on the planet that have any sort of experience in dealing with this sort of thing. The Russians do have some limited skills. Obviously, they've got plenty of experience. The problem is that the gutting of the Russian demographic structure is well underway, and the youngest people who were trained in the Soviet period with the full suite of technical skills necessary to do things like this, they're in their early 60s now. There just aren't enough people out there to do it, and the Russians have never had the capital to do it in any sort of scale. The other classification are places where the normal rules of the Arctic do not apply. There are a couple of places in the poles where warm water currents wash up against the coastline of the continent and make it a zone that is ice-free year-round. And the one that matters there the most is the North Atlantic drift going up to northwestern Europe. So the entirety of the Norwegian coast is ice-free year-round. And that's one of the reasons why Norway has become one of the world's preeminent energy powers, because they can go into the offshore oil and natural gas zones and produce year-round. They still have to deal with the depth. They still have to deal with offshore. They still have to deal with relatively light population densities. They still have to deal with storms. But at least they don't have to deal with moving sea ice. And as a first world country, they have capital access that the Russians simply can't match. The thing, however, though, is it's already ice-free. If you want anything more than what you've got right now, you've got to wait for the pole to melt out. And I have not seen a single estimate that suggests that the Arctic Ocean will be ice-free in the winter before the end of the century. Remember, the problem isn't just ice. It's seasonal ice that moves. And then the other issue is if you're not after resources, you might be after transport. The idea that you can ship things from Europe to East Asia back and forth much more easily than you can going the southern route through Suez or around Africa and India. Well, technically there might be something to that. But again, seasonal sea ice, you have to wait for the place to be ice-free. Otherwise, all the aids to navigation have to be redropped and recharted every single season. So again, seasonal route. And even if you're relying on an icebreaker, that icebreaker is going to be Russian. And in the current environment, there aren't a lot of people who want to rely upon the Russians for safety in times when there's distress, because for several thousand miles of empty trackless ocean and ice, there is no one else you can call. Finally, if you're going to do this, you're connecting East Asia, the most rapidly aging part of the planet, with Western Europe, which is the second most rapidly aging part of the planet. So you're making a long-term bet on two regions that demographically are not going to be able to trade much at all for much longer because they simply don't have any consumption that is going to be sustainable in the long run. So I don't think without everything else is water that comes from the sky. And it is an isthmus, and so there's not a very large water catchment issue. And that catchment issue also has to supply all of the water for the city of Panama, which is about home to 3/4 of the population of the country. So you get a prolonged drought event like they're in the middle of, and things are bad. If anything, it's worse than it sounds, because we're supposed to be in the middle of the wet season right now. The dry season starts in about 6 to 8 weeks, and so they know that this is going to get worse before it gets better, and they're probably going to have to wait till the next wet season, which isn't going to start until the beginning of next summer. In the meantime, the number of ships transiting the canal has already dropped by over a quarter, and of the ones that are still going through, they've had to reduce their draft by about a quarter, which means that the amount of weight that they can carry is reduced by about 40%. So the bigger ships aren't going in at all, the smaller ships are carrying less, and it adds up to very, very roughly-ish a 50% reduction in the throughput capacity of the canal. Now, for the United States, this is kind of a big deal. This is the piece of international infrastructure that we use by far the most, even more than that big bridge over the Great Lakes going to Canada. About 6% of global trade transits the canal. Most of that trade is from the United States, very heavy in the commodities space, energy and especially foodstuffs, going from the Mississippi and the East Coast into Panama and then across the Pacific. The alternate route is a few thousand miles longer. It crosses the Atlantic into the Mediterranean through Suez, around India, and then up to East Asia. Much more expensive route. Takes a couple weeks extra. It's not the best solution, even once you consider the extra cost. Keep in mind that really all it takes is one Filipino crew on a container ship throwing a party at the wrong time in the middle of the canal, and the ship can get stuck. And then that shuts down too. There's not a lot that anyone can do here. Building up the alternative infrastructure to ensure a backup water supply would require a few $billion and several years, and you would still have to wait for it to rain to fill up those reserve reservoirs. So really all we can do here is wait. About the only thing that I could suggest, and this is something that I think it's high time we do anyway, is for the United States to massively expand its production footprint in the processing of the raw commodities that it exports. Not only would you then have a much denser value ratio to weight and bulk for the things that you export, but there'd be a lot more economic of all places. We've got two separate strikes going on, one of which has at least temporarily been resolved, one involving the writers, which for the moment is behind us, they've settled, and one involving the actors. And the issue is honestly one of technology. With the advent of a sufficient processing power to allow streaming services over internet connections, we now have a number of major providers such as Hulu or Apple or Amazon or Netflix that are not just providing legacy shows, but new shows and transmitting them to their end users and consumers through a completely different network that doesn't use the normal TV radio approach, VHF, things like that. This means different models. It used to be that all the income came pretty much from advertising, and now there are different ways to do it with, say, a per-month subscription charge. You're going to see more and more and more in this going forward. So we have to split it in those two factions. So first, the labor that deals with the screenwriting, and then the labor that deals with the acting. So screenwriters. This is going to be an ongoing issue, largely because of the revenue play. When screenwriters used to produce things, whether it was for television or movies before, they'd work directly with the movie house, which would generate their income from either advertising or ticket sales. Now that you've got streaming, the question is what constitutes readership or viewership, because it's not the same model. And is it something that's a once and done? Is it something that gives them income over time? Because unless you're an A-lister where you can demand whatever terms you want, everyone else has to kind of suffer through. And for the writing, the rise of AI is providing more and more support for people who are particularly creative and leaving everyone else by the curb. But as problematic as that is from the point of view of the writers, it's a disaster for the actors. We already have technology that allows us to fill in the background with either a complete green screen generated system or even to a certain degree extras. And I think the two movies that have demonstrated how this technology is coming along the best, one is Ant-Man 2, the one where we had some characters who in today's world are in their 60s, but we had a couple of scenes where they were shown when they were in their 20s and their 30s, and you can use the technology to make people look younger. We've also had World War Z, which is a hot mess. Great book, horrible movie. But when you had the swarms of zombies, those weren't real zombies. They were all CGI generated. And we could see how they looked very, very real. Well, you play both of those movies forward, because those are both 5 years old now. And we're getting to the point where you can film an extra from a number of different angles and insert them into the background just fine. And so part of the reason that the actors were striking is because they were being asked to sign documents to basically surrender their future digital rights. So you're an extra in this movie, you're filmed, and then they reserve the right to recreate you royalty-free in the future. And obviously, if you're a low-ranking actor or an extra or an aspiring actor, that pretty much ends your career. It won't really hurt the A-listers, but pretty much everybody else would be left in the cold. And very soon, we're going to be able to take footage from people who are dead and use AI technologies to put them into leading roles if we want to. And so the balance, the ability for you to profit off your skill set and your presence all of a sudden isn't there anymore. And it's a question of who generates the revenue. And at the moment, the law suggests it's the people who control the AI-driven software and actually design the movies in the first place. So from a writer's point of view, this is going to get a little bit stickier as we move forward, but it's going to be more of an evolutionary process. But for the actors, you're actually looking at the evisceration of an entire class of people. And that will take with it the way movies are produced. Because if you can just have a handful of A-listers and B-listers who are doing kind of a number of the main roles and have the star power to draw people, and everything else is computer generated and looks as real as the real thing, then we're in a fundamentally different model